The best book I read a couple years ago is a 50-year-old plus book from 1966, Philip Rieff's The Triumph of the Therapeutic, Uses of Faith After Freud. I found it, I keep going back to it, and I keep just finding wonderful things in it. And although I don't agree with many of his conclusions, his piercing perception is absolutely mind-boggling. And this is a very difficult book, and it deserves a close reading. And so a lot of people say that it's a lot easier to read some of this stuff when you have someone else reading it, so you have their voice in your mind as you go through reading it. So I've transcribed the first introductory chapter, and perhaps you want to read along with me. Nevertheless, I think that this book really does the job of explaining what's happening to us as a culture and as individuals, because it talks about not only the emergence of psychological man, but the reorganization of personality. How one of my theses is, of course, that man is often merely the product of his culture. And so when we talk about what is happening with this tremendous cultural shift and the discarding of the culture of modernity and Christendom, what is emerging is quite alarming. And I think that Rieff in 1966 anticipated a lot of what's happened, but I also think he got a lot wrong in his predictive prognostications. So let me start off with the epigram to his introductory chapter on Toward a Theory of Culture. It's from Yeats's Second Coming, in which he says, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beasts, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So, I mean, that one's so overused, but nevertheless, I think it still does point out kind of this post-apocalyptic approach to the fall of our culture. Nevertheless, literature and sociology have long supplied eloquent and knowing professional mourners at the wake for Christian culture. After Matthew Arnold, much of modern poetry constitutes an elegiac farewell, mixed with powerful feelings of good riddance, to the religious culture of the West. After Auguste Comte, much of modern sociology has struggled for diagnostic ideas refined and yet wide enough to encompass the spectacle of death so great in magnitude and subtlety. Now, the dissolution of a unitary system of common belief, accompanied as it must be by a certain disorganization of personality, may have run its course. So this is a main theme of what we're about to encounter here, the disorganization of personality, after we've had a culture that has helped create the organization of personality. This long period, the long period of deconversion, which first broke the surface of political history at the time of French Revolution, thanks Rousseau, appears all but ended. The central symbolism of personal and corporate experience seems to be well on its way to being differently organized, with several systems of belief competing for primacy in the task of organizing personality in the West. Beyond its concerns with the dynamics by which Christian culture has been displaced, the present volume will concentrate upon a struggle with the camp of one among these displacing systems of belief. I intend to draw certain implications for the reorganization of Western culture and personality from the divergence between Freud and those of his most powerful successor critics studied in this book. And he studies C.G. Jung, Wilhelm Reich, and D.H. Lawrence in detail. Each get a chapter. In Freud's analytic attitude and in the efforts exerted by his successor critics to go beyond it to post-communal faiths, there are concentrated some aspects of theoretical problem that interest me greatly, well beyond the limits of this book, the problem of explaining cultural change. These preliminary studies in the psychohistorical process are not aimed at primarily fellow theorists interested in the problem, but as those troubled readers in whose minds and hearts one culture is dying while no other gains enough power to be born. As cultures change, so do the modal types of personality that are their bearers. One of the things that I think I say at the very beginning of my second book on sociology is to quote Socrates, in which we say that you can judge a society by the typical man it produces or its art. And so he's talking here about that typical type of personality that a culture is creating. As cultures change, so do the modal types of personality that are their bearers. The kind of man I see emerging as our culture fades into the next resembles the kind once called spiritual, because such a man desires to preserve the inherited morality, but freed from its hard external crust of institutional discipline. Yet a culture survives principally, I think, by the power of its institutions to bind and loose men in the conduct of their affairs with reasons which sink so deep into the self that they become commonly and implicitly understood, with that understanding of which explicit belief and precise knowledge of externals would show outwardly like the tip of an iceberg. In other words, we are so penetrated by our culture that our behavior really kind of just shows, as Coleridge once said, that men live like bats in twilight, picking up only the reflections and refractions of the philosophy which holds its age. And so as if we're all products of our culture, then we basically reflect those ideas, combined with our own personalities to an extent, and only that tip of the iceberg really comes out, whereas so much of what we've absorbed really sinks down below the surface of the water. And so spiritualizers of religion and the prescience of science fail to take into account the degree of intimacy with which this comprehensive interior understanding was cognate with historical institutions, binding even the ignorance of culture, those people that are ignorant of culture, to a great chain of meaning. Those institutions are responsible for conveying the social conditions of their acceptance by men, thus saved from destructive illusions of uniqueness and separateness. Having broken the outward form so as to liberate, allegedly, the inner meaning of the good, the beautiful, and the true, the spiritualizers, who set the pace of Western cultural life from before the beginning to a short time after the end of the 19th century, have now given way. The spiritualizers have now given way to their logical and historical successors, the psychologizers, inheritors of that dualist tradition which pits human nature against social order. Undeceived as they think about the sources of all morality, binding address, the psychologizers now fully established as the pace setters of cultural change. In other words, what he's saying here is it used to be that the spiritualizers were the midwives to culture. They were the elite that everybody kind of followed. They were kind of the bellwether, the flagship thinkers that decided the culture that shaped the rest of man. And now what he's saying is that they have given way, and the people that have taken their place are the psychologizers. This is the great triumph of Freud in the Therapeutic. And so, and now that they are fully established as the pace setters of cultural change, these psychologizers propose to help men avoid doing further damage to themselves by preventing live deceptions from succeeding the dead perceptions, the dead ones. But in order to save themselves from falling apart with their culture, men must engender another, different and yet powerful enough in its reorganization of experience to make themselves capable again of controlling the infinite variety of panic and emptiness to which they are disposed. It is to control their disease as individuals that men have always acted culturally in good faith. In other words, what he's saying is that there's something inside of all of us that have a predisposition to panic and emptiness. And so culture used to fill that void. And now that we're having a new culture emerge, the question is it doing that? Or are we setting ourselves loose to more panic and existential emptiness? Books and parading prayers and sciences, music and piety towards parents. These are a few of the many instruments by which a culture may produce the saving larger self for the control of panic and the filling up of emptiness. Superior to and encompassing the different modes in which it appears, a culture must communicate ideals, setting as internalities those distinctions between right action and wrong that unite men and permit them fundamental pleasure of agreement. This is that center that no longer seems to be holding in Yeats' experience. Culture is another name for designs of motives directing the self outward toward those communal purposes in which alone the self can be realized and satisfied. Aristotle said we're social animals and that we have to mix amongst others. That's just the way that we are, and we find our self by being a part of a social culture. A reorganization of those dialectical expressions of yes and no, the interplay of which constitutes culture, transforming motive into conduct, is occurring throughout the West. In other words, everything's being reorganized. The things that we used to think were the things that our culture said yes to and said no to, and the things that motivated our activity and our behavior are being reorganized. Throughout the West, particularly in the United States and in England, it is to be expected that some instruments appropriate to our inherited organization of permissions and restraints upon action will not survive the tension of fundamental reorganization. But suppose the tension is driven deeper, so deep that all communications of ideas come under permanent and easy suspicion. I think that's exactly what's happened. Is now anybody that asserts that something is better or even best, or conversely someone who says that's worse or worst, is the enemy. The person who discerns and tries to set up a hierarchy of values is the man that is being attacked. Everything is being leveled. Everything is considered to be just relative, and no objective truth, no scale, no hierarchy of values can be established or paid reverence to. And so instead, what we have is what Eric Vogelin called is kind of the transvaluation of values, where what was used to be bad is now good. Nevertheless, to find my spot again here is we're talking about the reorganization of culture. But suppose the tension is driven deeper, again to restate this, so deep that all communications of ideals come under permanent and easy suspicion. The question is no longer, as Dostoevsky put it, can civilized men believe, but rather, can unbelieving men be civilized? To raise again the questions of nihilism, as sociology says, since Auguste Comte had done, demonstrates a major change in tone. The note of apprehension has gone out of the asking. We believe we know something our predecessors did not, that we can live freely at last, enjoying all our senses, except the sense of the past, as unremembering, honest, and friendly barbarians all, in a technological Eden. Comte would have substituted a religion of humanity for its enfeebled predecessor. Max Weber proposed no substitute religion. Matthew Arnold could still listen for the distant echoes of the sea of faith. Yeats knew that there was a desert where once that sea might have been. To raise up faith from its stony sleep encourages the possibility of living again through the nightmare history of the last half century. You see, this is one of the things that I really disagree as I find myself going through Rieff's book, that no, I think the 20th century is evidence of what hell we create on earth when men stop believing in heaven. And so, but yeah, he's sitting here saying, no, the 20th century's wars were due to the fact that we were still attuned to that Christian culture, and I think that's absolutely wrong. I think that when you look at Germany particularly, this was a culture that had abandoned in all but its name its Christianity. And you go to the churches in Germany or Austria today, or anywhere in the Occident, frankly, you will find the emptiness of them and affirmation of that very thought. But nevertheless, Yeats did not hope for either restoration or parody of the established faith. Rather, he prayed for the very modern sort of second coming. in which men would recover their innocence, chiefly by accepting the fact that it is self-delighting, self-appeasing, and self-affrighting, and, quote, that its own sweet will is heaven's will, unquote. In our recovered innocence, to be entertained would be to become the highest good, and boredom the most common evil. The best spirits of the 20th century have thus expressed their conviction that the original innocence, which to earlier periods was a sinful conceit, is now the new center, which can be held even as communities disintegrate. The new center is the self. By this conviction, a new dynamic acceptance of disorder, in love with life and destructive of it, has been loosed upon the world. Here, literature and sociology converge, for the ultimate interest of sociology, like that of psychiatry when it is not lost in a particular patient, turns on the question whether our culture can be so reconstructed that faith, some compelling symbolic of self-integration, integrating communal purpose, need no longer superintend the organization of personality. In other words, can we have civilized organization of personality without some faith that tells us thou shalt and thou shalt not, or have an example like Christ that gives us an answer to the question, how then shall we live? That's his question that he's posing for us in postmodernity. So long as a culture maintains its vitality, whatever must be renounced disappears and is given back bettered. Freud called this process sublimation. But, as that sage among psychiatrists Harry Stack Sullivan once said, quote, if you tell people how they can sublimate, they can't sublimate. The dynamics of culture are in, quote, the unwitting part of it. So in other words, it's almost one of the things that the moment you turn to look at it, it disappears. The moment you become conscious of your sublimation, you're no longer sublimating your energies. It becomes self-destructive of that sublimated power. So now our renunciations have failed us. Less and less is given back bettered. For this reason, chiefly, I think, this culture, which once imagined itself inside a church, feels trapped in something like a zoo of separate cages. Modern men are like Rilke's panther, forever looking out from one cage into another, because the modern sense of identity seems outraged by imprisonment in either an old church or a new cage. It is the obligation of sociology, so far as they remain interested in assessing the quality of our corporate life, to analyze doctrinal as well as organizational profiles of the rage to be free from the inherited morality, the better to see how these differ from what is being raged against. In other words, why are we trying to rage against our inherited culture? Why are we trying to reject this tremendous cultural inheritance that has been passed down to us for thousands of years? I shall attend to a few of the exemplary enraged and to the sense in which it may be said that they express general sentiments. If the question, quote, how are we to be saved, cannot be asked in traditional ways, or need not be asked at all, then is it still the professional obligation of sociologists, who are specially interested in the behavior of collectivities, to investigate the ensuing honest silence in which the communal gods have imitated the most cultivated man. And indeed, this is the sort of investigation the sociologies have pursued ardently from the time of Comte through that of Weber to my contemporaries. Perhaps no other problem than that of changing moral configuration of modern culture has so engaged the interest of sociological theorists. During the 19th century, when sociology helped in a major way to construct a central experience of deconversion toward an anti-creedal, analytic attitude, and this is very key. This is kind of the whole fulcrum, he says, that has happened here. Here's the point of departure. Sociology during the 19th century helped the central experience of this man in this culture, which is the deconversion of him from a Christian culture toward an anti-creedal, analytic attitude that was really ushered in when Freud began offering his psychoanalysis. And so the sociology profession, that discipline, suffered from a vast overconfidence, both about its own advance and about the progress of culture, which it understood as undergoing varieties of such deconversions. Progress, wrote Spencer, is not an accident, but a necessity. Surely must evil and immorality disappear. Surely must men become perfect, unquote. A basic transformation of culture appeared both inevitable and desirable. Running parallel with and in the opposite direction from the process of deconversion was that process of conversion to a superior system of symbols, the symbols of science, which would supply the next predicate for the cultural organization of personality. In other words, we were going to stop being religious and we were going to be scientific. And around those principles, we would organize our personality. And Spencer thought it would be a better one for some reason. Comte, for example, understood his own time as one of transition between two cultures. It was more generally proposed by students of our collective condition, not merely that the old religious culture was dying, but that the new scientific one had quite enough power already to be born. Thus, Comte concluded that only because of the coexistence of these two cultures did, quote, the grand crisis now experienced by the most civilized nations, unquote, persist. Freud was less sanguine. He believed that the crisis of coexistence, the coexistence again between the emerging scientific culture and the remaining remnants of the Christian culture, that coexistence to Freud was probably a permanent mode of the relation between personality and culture. I question whether the grand crisis, our deeper trouble, can be attributed to coexistence, as major figures among the 19th century intellectuals culminating in Freud insisted. It is less the lingering of old culture than the emergence of the new that still needs diagnosis. In fact, evil and immorality are disappearing, as Spencer assumed they would, mainly because our culture is changing its definition of human perfection. No longer the saint, but the instinctual everyman, twisting his neck uncomfortably inside the starched collar of culture, is the communal ideal now, to whom men offer tacit prayers for deliverance from their inherited renunciations. Freud sought only to soften the collar. Others, using bits and pieces of his genius, would like to take the collar off entirely. There have been forerunners of this movement: Rousseau, Bean, Hamann, or Blake. But never before has there been such a general shifting of sides as now amongst intellectuals in the United States and in England. Many have gone over to the enemy, to the side of the instinctual evermen, without ever realizing that they, the self-considered, the cultural elite, have actually become spokesmen for what Freud called the instinctual mass. Much of modern literature constitutes a symbolic act of going over to the side of the latest, most original individualist. This represents the complete democratization of culture. It was in order to combat just such a talented hostility to culture that Freud emphasized coercion and the renunciation of instinct as indispensable elements in all culture. Freud was neither a eroticist nor a Democrat. His theory of culture depended upon a crossing between his idea of moral authority and an elitist inclination. Quote, "It is just as impossible," he writes, "to do without control of the mass by a minority as it is to dispense with coercion in the work of civilization." Unquote. By mass, Freud means not merely the lazy and unintelligent, but more importantly, those who, quote, "have no love for instinctual renunciation, and who can not be, quote, convinced by argument of its inevitability." In other words, what he's saying, and of course I make this point too, that what Freud really attempted to do with his triad of the ego, the superego, and the id, is that he tried to really reject the superego and reconcile the id with the ego. In other words, our conscious thought was looking for better reasons to allow its wish fulfillment that came from the id, but that you couldn't quite do that without renunciating Freud says, without renunciating the worst parts of our id and our instinctual id. And so, again, the Antichrist, remember, is not totally wrong. It's not totally evil. It is mixed goodness with evil. It is a lot of falsity mixed with a healthy portion of good. I think Freud got a lot right, but I think that basically what he did is unloosed the demons of our souls to take over our psyches. Nevertheless, Freud thought that renunciation of our instinct was inevitable. It had to happen in order for us to become civilized. That such large numbers of the cultivated and intelligent have identified themselves deliberately with those who are supposed to have no love for instinctual renunciation suggests to me that the most elaborate act of suicide that Western intellectuals have ever staged, those intellectuals, whether of the left or right, whose historical function it has been to assert the authority of a culture organized in terms of communal purpose through the agency of congregations of the faithful. And so, that's a really good note, but I'm going to pass that. Continuing on, of course, this suicide is intended only as an exciting pose by these intellectuals, these cultural elites. Renunciations of instinct, as Freud wrote, quote, necessarily must remain, unquote. For these renunciations, the individual must be compensated by pleasures at once higher and more realizable than the pleasure of instinctual gratification. In compensation, and in place of where faith once was, men are offered art and or science. It is true that new religions are constantly being born, but modern culture is unique in having given birth to such elaborately argued anti-religions, all aiming to confirm us in our devastating illusions of individuality and freedom. I suspect that the children of Israel did not spend much time elaborating a doctrine of the golden calf. They naively danced around it until Moses, their first intellectual, put a stop to the plain fun and insisted on civilizing them by submerging their individualities within a communal purpose. Now, although there is still some dancing, the intellectuals mainly sit around and think in awe about the power and perversity of their instincts, disguising their rancorous worship of the self in the religion of art. Confronted thus with a picture gallery as the new center of self-worship, civilized men must become again anti-art in the hope of shifting attention toward modalities of worship wholly other than that of self. And I think there's some truth in this, but I really think what we need to do is we need to reject the foolishness of that individualist expressionist art and get back to what art's real design should and always had been previous to the modern nihilistic approach to art, which is that it is that glimpse of the transcendent, and it shows us the true, the beautiful, and the good. And once we put that as the main goal of art, and explaining our human condition to us in really redeeming terms, then art really does nothing but pull us all down. And so, in my chapters on Rieff and Lawrence, I shall represent some ways in which art and science have come to serve the contemporary aversion to culture. I think Roger Scruton does this best by talking about the culture of ugliness and how a lot of people who shun beauty because it is actually kind of just a gift from God here on this temporal plane, that they've rejected the good, the true, and the beautiful, so they find themselves gravitating toward a culture of ugliness, where that hierarchy of values, we experience that transvaluation of values, and ugly becomes the ideal rather than the beautiful. And so he's talking about art and science have come to serve the contemporary aversion to culture. This aversion has grown less naive, more doctrinal, and therefore more dangerous. For these are doctrines of psychological man, the latest and perhaps supreme individualist, opposed in depth to earlier modes of self-salvation, through identification with communal purpose. In other words, it used to be that, he talks about this in a little bit here, about the saving purpose of culture. Jung is the most interesting case. As a cultural conservative, his psychology is para-religious, striving as it does to reestablish various corporate identities and communal purposes as purely therapeutic devices. In contrast to the conservative Jung, Rieff and Lawrence are moral revolutionaries, in a more straightforward way. Neither proposes to defend communal common purposes, which once persisted through the individualization of those energies called conscience, generated for the saving selves precisely by means of a communal purpose. And I'm not going to get into the point here that Freud denied the idea of a conscience, that inbuilt navigational system that always points towards true north, that is really the voice of God within our soul, whereas the ego is the voice of ourselves, our rational selves. The id is that kind of subconscious, that is the voice of our instincts, and the superego is, I guess I am going into it, but nevertheless, the superego is the voice of our peers, of our parents, and our pop culture. It's constantly yammering at us. Well, the conscience, on the other hand, is kind of like that Jiminy Cricket that's always there. It's the little angels that's the voice of the Holy Spirit in us that really does let us know the difference between good and bad, good and evil, and right and wrong. And so if we listen to our conscience, but of course conscience can be completely perverted and twisted as well, primarily by the suppression of that voice. Nevertheless, the debts incurred by conscience through warped and atrophied communal purposes are now being paid off at a usurious rate of interest. The lingering death of authoritarian love has left behind hatred and violence, twin widows of dead love, free to stimulate in the culturally impoverished or disenchanted energies emancipated from conviction. In other words, when we are severed from the face of our forefathers, we're willing to throw our latent enthusiasm behind any violent cause, as Russell Kirk once said. It is not class or race war that we have to fear so much as the deadly violence between the culture classes. But the upper culture classes have already lost this most fundamental of all class struggles by their admiration for the vitality of the lower class, that vitality being a mirror image of their own earlier dynamism. A social structure shakes with violence and shivers with fears of violence, not merely when that structure is callously unjust, but also when its members must stimulate themselves to feverish activity in order to demonstrate just how alive they are. That there are colonies of the violent among us, devoid of any stable sense of communal purpose, best describes, I think, our present temporarily schizoid existence in two cultures, vacillating between dead purposes and deadly devices to escape boredom. A full transition to a post-communal culture may never be achieved. It is a persuasive argument still that maintains there are safeguards built into both human nature and culture, limiting the freedom of men to atomize themselves. Perhaps human nature will revolt, producing yet another version of second nature with which to fend off and curb the vitality of the present assault upon the moralizing functions of our past. Every culture, and this is why I always say that civilizations rise and fall as the permanent things fall in and out of favor, and that civilization will crash again and again upon a rocky coast like an angry sea. And so what he's saying, however, is that perhaps a whole new second nature of man may emerge. And I totally disagree with that. I think that human nature is fixed, although infinitely malleable. And so postmodern man can't really think like modern man, and modern man can't think like medieval man, and medieval man can't think like classical man. And so we make the mistake of thinking that they saw everything the way that we did, but we must begin with the idea that we all had the same human nature, even though it was malleable throughout the eras. And so whether you're watching Homer Simpson or you're reading Homer's Odyssey, they're still dealing with the same 7 deadly sins, and they're still dealing with the same virtues of human nature. And so the point is, unless we're going to destroy virtues entirely, or we're going to transvalue values entirely so that way good becomes bad and bad becomes good, human nature itself is a fixed thing, and our normative, our permanent normative enduring values will continue. It's just we're going to either get closer or farther away from them as time goes on. So, Every culture must establish itself as a system of moralizing demands, images that mark the trail of each man's memory. Thus, to distinguish right actions from wrong, the inner ordinances are set. The inner ordinances are set, by which men are guided in their conduct so as to assure a mutual security of contact. Culture is indeed the highest learning, but this higher learning is not acquired at universities. Rather, it is assimilated continuously from earliest infancy, when human beings first begin to trust in those familiar responses others make to their overtures. In every culture, there stands a censor, governing the opportunity of recognition and responding to novel stimuli. That governor, those inner ordinances, inclined always to censoriousness about novelty, the governor we may call then faith. Faith is the compulsive dynamic of culture, channeling obedience to, trust in, and dependence upon authority. In other words, if we don't have an authority towards which we can orientate our inner ordinances, we kind of get lost. We're just kind of wandering all over the place. We don't know where to turn. We don't know the difference between right and wrong. Of course, I reject this with my idea of conscience, but in terms of cultural, there's a lot of gray area where what is better and best, sometimes it's not made plain to us by that conscience. With more or less considered passion, men submit to the moral demand system, and moreover to its personifications, from which they cannot detach themselves except at the terrible cost of guilt that such figures of authority exact from those not yet so indifferent that they have ceased troubling to deny them. Now, contradicting all faiths, a culture of indifference is being attempted, lately using a rhetoric of commitment with which to enlarge the scope of its dynamism. In other words, what we're saying is we have the thing that happens in this post-Christian culture is that we have a culture of indifference, and you must be committed to it. You must be committed to indifference. And it's really what I think is a very strange paradox. Such a credo of change amounts to a new faith. More precisely, it's a counterfaith. This counterfaith intimates the next culture. For faith, or its negative, is always and everywhere the generating and corrupting agent of culture. This is not to say that contemporary culture is corrupt. What appears to some as corruption indicates the generation of yet another culture, for none is immortal. While disassociating itself from the high costs of old doctrinal seriousness and lonely lives, the emergent culture nevertheless produces books and music, art and sciences, an endless ambiance of fun and boredom. Everything, in fact, including moral passion and communal purpose, as varieties of an anti-typal therapy of self. To call corrupt a culture purchased at lower costs to our nerves and at larger magnitudes of self-fulfillment would show a lamentable lack of imagination. Let's draw down on this particular line. I'm going to read it again. To call a culture that is purchased at a lower cost to our nerves and at a larger magnitude of our own self-fulfillment, to call that culture corrupt, he says, would show a lamentable lack of imagination. The look of the future need not be blank and pitiless. Intelligence may work more efficiently, after all, than compassionate solidarity. Counter-transference may succeed where less calculated loves have failed. Basically, what he's saying is, well, maybe it is good that we are shedding this culture which had all of these taboos that racked us with such guilt and shame, and it made us aspire towards our salvation. Maybe the real goal should be merely self-fulfillment and our own sense of well-being, which he goes into a little bit further. I think he makes a terrible mistake here, and I think that in the 50 years since he wrote this book, I think that what we see here is that as more and more of the problems that we really have as a culture fall away due to our prosperity, the old problems are coming back and they're even worse. with the existential emptiness of people that try to fill them. We have more plenitude than we've ever had, but yet people still feel that they have this existential emptiness inside of them, which they, of course, just try to stuff with more and more stuff. Or they are constantly pursuing material gains or status without ever doing that inner work to rise through the levels of consciousness, which I think is really the only way to achieve true contentment and happiness. And I don't think he could really see where his logic was leading him. He says that the look of the future need not be blank and pitiless. And of course, it's certainly not blank, but sometimes it's quite pitiless. Religious imagination is purblind, and its obstinate visionaries take risks, resulting in such personifications of the parousia, the second coming of Christ, as Yeats saw slouching towards Bethlehem. Then we will have to make our way to a more pleasant city, using our secular vision of comforts that render all salvations obsolete. In other words, he who dies with the most toys wins. And whether or not you make it to heaven or hell doesn't matter anymore. Wow, what a huge mistake I think he's making here. Nevertheless, I think he is doing a wonderful job of sounding the analytical attitude and the attitude of the instinctual everyman, of the psychological man, which is that really all we're trying to do is make ourselves feel good about our sense of self, our well-being. And then he goes into this little part here. He says, I too aspire to see clearly like a rifleman with one eye shut. I too aspire to think without assent. This is the ultimate violence to which the modern intellectual is committed. Since things have become as they are, I too share the modern desire not to be deceived. The culture to which I was first habituated grows progressively different in its symbolic nature and its human product. That double difference on how ordained augments our ambivalence as the professional mourners. But he doesn't seem to see that as the symbols of the Christian culture changes and morphs, that perhaps maybe what it's changing to is the wrong things, and that what we are doing is we're forgetting the really important things, and it's that we need to go back and recover those in order to go forward. He says, on the other hand, he can just kind of tell that he is exhausted with the Christian culture as well, and he's trying to look for something new. He says that there seems to be little likelihood of a great rebirth of the old corporate ideals. The proletariat was the most recent notable corporate identity, the last failed god. By this time, men have gone too far, beyond the old deceptions of good and evil, to specialize at last, wittingly, in techniques that are to be called, in the present volume, therapeutic, with nothing at stake beyond a manipulatable sense of well-being. Here it is. This is the whole point of everything that he's talking about from this point forward. No longer are we trying to become good men. We're trying to feel good about ourselves. No longer are we trying to save our souls. We are trying to grope our way toward a sense of well-being. And that is the whole point of the Freudian therapeutic, which is to make our rational selves feel good about ourselves. And all of our wish fulfillment and all of our dark ids calling on us and reject the super issue, yada yada. So nevertheless, this is the unreligion of the age and its master science. What the ignorant have always felt, the knowing now know. After millennial distractions by stratagems that did not heighten the more intimate pleasures. The systematic hunting down of all settled convictions represents the anti-cultural predicate upon which modern personality is now being organized. Now, not only in the West, but more slowly in the non-West. The Orient and Africa are thus being culturated in a dynamism that has already grown substantial enough to torment its progenitors with the nightmares of revenge for having so unsettled the world. And I think that this is really, if you really want to know why the Muslim world is reacting so violently against us, is that to some extent they see that the Western liberalism, neoliberalism, and particularly this Freudian therapeutic is a very revolutionary and unsettling force. Not to say that I think that in any way the Muslim world has a monopoly on values, or that their values is somehow better than the values that have throughout the long climb of Western civilization proven themselves to be the answer to which the question of how then shall we live. I mean, the Western civilization was built around the idea of Christendom, of how then shall we live? We shall live as Christ did. To imitate Christ, imitate our Savior, is how we become saved. And the Beatitudes completely, although they didn't repudiate the Ten Commandments, they completely turned them on their head. The Ten Commandments were predominantly thou shalt not, whereas the Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount, Christ showed us how then shall you live. And that was, I think, the revolutionary aspect of Christianity on which Western civilization was built. And I think and then this is the whole point of this book, is we're discarding that culture for a new therapeutic attitude that is destructive of that old culture. And because it's so powerful and revolutionary, the rest of the world is rebelling against that in a sense too. So again, I think the answer is, of course, we need to get back to Christian values, but we need to do it in a way that fits with our particular historical, psychohistorical point on the arc of time. So, it is a terrible error to see the West as conservative and the East as revolutionary. We are the true revolutionaries. The East is swiftly learning to act as we do, which is anti-conservative in a way non-Western peoples have only recently begun to fully realize for themselves. In the regular acting out of mandatory therapies of commitment, built into the charter of his society, man, as a creation of affection and censorious authority, once organized for himself modes of willing obedience or faith, in which he found his sense of well-being, and also his freedom from that singular criterion. Wow, what a very complicated sentence. Let me just say it again. In the regular acting out of mandatory therapies of commitment built into the charter of his society, man, as a creation of affectionate and censorious authority, once organized for himself modes of willing obedience or faith, in which he found his sense of well-being, and also his freedom from that singular criterion. Culture without cultus appears, in almost all historical cases, appears to be a contradiction in terms. Take a long time to unravel that. Those of you who get it, you get it. Within the mechanisms of the cult, culture was organized consistently mainly of ritual efforts to elicit and produce stable responses of assurance to more or less fixed wants, fleshly and spiritual, as it used to be said. There was then a standard range of expectations from which reassurance was elicited, even though the responses of eliciting agencies rendered sacred by their supreme function of organizing of a life worth living might at any moment offer admonitions rather than consolations to the seeker. Thus, the sacred socializing agencies composed a moral order. And there's a great post-note here about Nietzsche, but I'm going to skip that too. One main clue to the understanding of the social organization is to be found in its symbolic of communal purposes. This, in turn, operates through a social system enacting the symbolic in a way at once admonitory and consoling. In other words, we get admonitions, don't do this, don't do that, but then we're also like, oh yeah, well, if you do that, you can have these consoling, loosen remissions. Each culture is its own order of therapy, a system of moralizing demands, including remissions that ease the pressure of communal purposes. Therapeutic elites before our own time were predominantly supportive rather than critical of culture as a moral demand system. Admonitions were the expectable predicates of consolations. That is what is meant nowadays by a guilt culture. Whenever therapeutic elites grow predominantly critical, then a culture revolution may be said to be in progress. Ours is such a time. The Occident has long been such a place. Until the present culture rose to threaten its predecessor, our moral demand system could be specified by the kind of creedal hedges it raised around impulse of independence or autonomy from the communal purpose. In the culture preceding our own, the order of therapy was embedded in a consensus of shout nots. The best never lacked binding convictions, for they were the most bound. The best people never lacked binding convictions. The best people were the ones that bound themselves to those convictions, lived within them, and then found their freedom and liberty within those hedges. They were the ones most bound mainly by what they should not do or even think or dream. Thou shalt precipitated a sequence of operative shalt nots. Cultic therapies of commitment never mounted a search for some new opening into experience. On the contrary, new experience wasn't even wanted. Cultic therapy domesticated the wildness of experience. By treating some novel stimulus or ambiguity of experience in this manner, the apparently new was integrated into a restrictive and collective identity. Cultic therapies consisted therefore chiefly in participation mystiques severely limiting deviant initiatives. Individuals were trained through ritual action to express fixed wants, although they could not count thereby upon commensurate gratifications. The limitations of possibilities was the very design of salvation. In other words, it used to be that we didn't even think about so many of these terrible perversities and deviancies from the social norm. And now it is, go for it. Everything is just go for it. Don't let any of those old taboos. Taboos are meant to be broken, is the mentality of today's loosed psychological man. To the ironic question, quote, and being saved, how are we to behave, unquote, Western culture long returned to a painfully simple answer: behave like your Savior. Christian culture, like organizations of moral demand, operated, however imperfectly, through the internalization of a soteriological character ideal. Soteriological means involving the salvation of your soul. The organization of moral demands used to be things that would help you save your soul by having character ideals, particularly that by imitating the greatest icon, the greatest. What am I trying to come up with? The greatest example is our Savior Christ, and this soteriological character ideal carried tremendous potentials for fresh intakes of communal energy, the highest level of controls and remissions, which together organized the system of moral demands. But this experienced and historical, it was experienced as an historical and individualized incarnation, that is Christ. Such euhemerist processes may have been indispensable to the vitality of old culture. Euhemerist means that they believe that that was actually a mythologization of actual events. He's kind of taking a shot here of whether or not Christ really existed, which is not to be surprising. Then I guess we shouldn't consider that surprising considering what he said about his willingness to discard the Christian culture, or at least not believe in what he's saying here are the formations of it. So such euhemerist processes may have been indispensable to the vitality of the old culture. To adjust the expression of impulses to the controlling paragon or character ideal defines the primary process in the shaping of our inherited culture. The arts and science defined the secondary process. In other words, religion defined our old culture, arts and sciences now define the secondary process in which, no, actually that's not what he's saying here. Let me start this over again. To adjust the expression of impulses to the controlling paragon or character ideal defines the primary process in the shaping of our inherited culture. The arts and sciences define the secondary process. In other words, we have a character ideal, a normative example, the best example that does the real shaping, but then along that, the arts and sciences create a whole bunch of symbols which help light the way and act as guideposts in the memory of man, as he said earlier. It's a secondary process in which exemplary modes of action are extended further into a central moralizing experience, thus transforming the individual into institutional action. In the classical Christian culture of commitment, one renunciatory mode of control referred to the sexual opportunism of individuals. Now he's going to go into this whole thing about abstinence. Bear with me, I'll get through it quickly. Contemporary churchmen may twist and turn while they try to make themselves heard in a culture that renders preaching superfluous. The fact remains that the renunciatory controls of sexual opportunity were placed in the Christian culture very near the center of the symbolic that has not held. Current apologetic efforts by religious professionals in pretending that renunciation as the general mode of control was never dominant in the system reflect a strange mixture of cowardice and courage with which they are participating in the dissolution of their cultural functions. Older Christian scholarship has known better than the new Christian apologetics. And then he quotes here J.A.T. Robinson, Honest to God, in which he says, at bottom only a single point was dealt with, abstinence from sexual relationships. Everything else was secondary, for he who would renounce these sexual relationships found nothing hard. Renunciation of the servile yoke of sin was the watchword of Christians, and an extraordinary unanimity prevailed as to the meaning of this watchword, whether we turn to the Coptic porter or the learned Greek teacher, to the bishop of Hippo, or Jerome the Roman presbyter, or the biographer of St. Martin. Virginity was the specifically Christian value and the essence of all virtues. In this conviction, the meaning of the evangelical law was summed up. Historically, the rejection of sexual individualism, which divorces pleasure from procreation, was the consensual matrix of Christian culture. It was never the last line drawn. On the contrary, before that restriction, there were drawn others, establishing the Christian corporate identity within which the individual was to organize the rage of his experience. Individuality was hedged round by this discipline of sexuality, challenging those rapidly fluctuating imperatives established in Rome's remissive culture, from which a new order of deprivations was intended to release the faithful Christian believer. Every controlling symbolic contains such remissive functions. What is revolutionary in modern culture refers to the release from inherited doctrines of therapeutic deprivation from a predicate of renunciatory control, enjoining release from impulse need. And our culture has shifted towards a predicate of impulse release, projecting controls unsteadily based upon an infinite variety of wants, raised to the status of needs. What this basically means here is he's saying that Christian culture was always about remaining pure sexually, waiting for marriage, having sex only with that one person, and that if you were able to have the strength to fight off your instinctive urge to be a slut, that all the other things that would raise your personality to a higher level of consciousness would become easy. Now, with the renunciation of that impulse, now what has become ascendant is that impulse release is the necessary thing in our culture. In other words, we've got to follow our impulses, and if we try to suppress that, we create a neuroses in ourselves. And so that's why we have this, feels good, do it kind of culture. Just go around and be as big of a slut as you want to be, and without in any way wounding yourself. And of course, we're now seeing just how ridiculous of a premise that really is. So an infinite variety of wants have been raised to the status of needs. Difficult as the modern cultural condition may be, I doubt that Western man can be persuaded again to the Greek opinion that the secret of happiness is to have as few needs as possible. The philosophers of the therapeutic deprivation are disposed to eat well when they are not preaching. It is hard to take Schopenhauer as a ascetic word when we know that what splendid dinners he had put on day after day at the Hotel Schwan in Frankfurt. The central Christian symbolic was not ascetic in a crude renunciatory mode, which would destroy any culture. Max Scheler, one of my biggest heroes, described that culture accurately, I think, when he concluded that Christian asceticism, at least so far, and it was influenced by decadent Hellenistic philosophy, had as its purpose not the suppression or even extirpation of natural drives, but rather their control and complete spiritualization of those drives. Instead of it being just merely animalistic instinct that gave us our drives and our impulses towards sexual promiscuity, what Scheler's saying is the Christian culture channeled that towards its spiritualization. And so sexual relations with our wife ends up being this transcendent spiritual thing that brings us closer to God. That's why when you have orgasm, so many people go, oh my God. Even the unbelieving do that. Because that's, for the average sensual man, that's the closest he's going to get to a really holy, sacred, transcendent experience, sad to say. Back to Scheler's quote that's being pulled out here. It is positive, not negative asceticism aimed fundamentally at liberation of the highest powers of personality from blockage by the automatism of the lower drives. Unquote. That renunciatory mode in which the higher powers of personality are precisely those which subserve rather than subvert culture. Let me say this again. It's the renunciatory mode in which the higher powers of personality are precisely those which help buttress and serve culture rather than subvert that culture, appear no longer systematically efficient, to Rieff here. The spiritualizers have had their day. Nowadays, the best among them appear engaged in a desperate strategy of acceptance, in the hope that by embracing doctrinal expressions of therapeutic aims, they will be embraced by the therapeutics. A false hope. The therapeutics need no doctrines, they only need opportunities. But the spiritualizers persist in trying to maintain cultural contact with constituencies already deconverted in all but name. Even Roman Catholic clergy must now confront their own constituencies, as the Protestant and Jewish colleagues have had to do long before. Nevertheless, religious professionals have reason to hope for survival precisely because they have come to be aware of their situation and are seeking ways to alter it in the direction of a fresh axis of communal purpose centered in the Negro protest movement or in some other movement of protest against the effects of that very dead culture which they think, by protesting so belatedly, to survive. The death of culture begins when its normative institutions fail to communicate ideals in ways that remain inwardly compelling. First of all, to the cultural elites themselves. Very important sentence here. How do cultures die? The death of culture begins, I'm repeating this, the death of culture begins when its normative institutions fail to communicate ideals in a way that remain inwardly compelling. First of all, to the cultural elites. Many spokesmen for our established normative institutions are aware of their failure and yet remain powerless to generate in themselves the necessary unwitting part of their culture that merits the name of faith. Quote, is not the very fact that so wretchedly little binding address is heard in the church, said Karl Barth, rhetorically in 1939. Quote, is this the fact that we don't hear anybody preaching, you must do this and you must not do that, in the church, accountable for a goodly share of the church's misery? Is it not perhaps the misery, Barth asks? The misery of this culture is acutely stated by the special misery of its normative institutions. Our more general misery is that, having broken with those institutionalized credibilities from which its moral energy is derived, new credibilities are not yet operationally effective, and perhaps cannot become so in a culture that is constantly probing its own unwitting part. It may be argued, and this is just nihilism on top of nihilism on top of nihilism. It's skepticism turned into cynicism and then running amok. You want to make a declarative statement about what is better or best, what is more generous, what is more goodly. Well, that's going to be attacked by every other cynic. And if we're all nothing but cynics, nothing can cohere in the center, as Yeats says, cannot hold. Everything becomes atomized. Everything is fragmented. Everything becomes relative. Everything becomes leveled. And we just become instinctual everyman. Everything, it's the rise of the savage. We're barbarians again. It's the abolition of man, as C.S. Lewis called it. So perhaps because we've broken with the institutionalized credibilities from our previous culture, new credibilities are not operationally effective, perhaps because they cannot become so in a culture that is constantly probing its unwitting part. It may be argued against this position that Western culture was never deeply believing, at least not in the Christian manner, which in a number of its most persuasive varieties encouraged the seeking after individual salvations at the expense of the collective one. Even so, Christian culture survived because it superintended the organization of Western personality in ways that produced the necessary corporate identities, serving a larger communal purpose institutionalized in the churches themselves. And look, Christianity from Christ has always said that salvation is an individual thing. You can be in the worst evil milieu possible. You could grow up amongst thieves and still be redeemed and find salvation. It was always an individual thing. But Christian culture also believed that you're more likely to come to Christ if you have a culture that transmits those beliefs by assuming those beliefs. Okay? And so I don't think he quite gets the whole concept here of the purpose. I mean, sure, there was a communal purpose behind Christianity to make a Christian culture a city of God here in the city of man, but nevertheless, Christian always believed that salvation was an individual thing. It's something that you had to find yourself. But that didn't mean you didn't do it without the help of your family, your culture, the little platoons of life, and even the larger society in general. If you look, this is the thing, go back to the whole concept I say about the good society, that you can judge a society by the typical man it creates or its art. That when you look at societies, like for example, the suburban man who is able to come to faith or the rural man who's able to come to faith and rise through that level towards the beatific, because this culture encourages that, versus the man of the inner city today, who you look at, you go, that guy never had a choice. He's totally surrounded in this nihilistic evil culture that puts the self and his greedy self-interest above everything else. If we were to agree with Ralph Cram that human nature is merely the raw material out of which the rare individual may be constructed from time to time, those people never were shown how the building blocks fit together to become a person of substance. And so what you have societies full of people that never have hope, and they've lost the dignity and the initiative to become better people. And that's where we really need to start there. And I don't think that for all of his amazing insight here, I don't think that Rieff totally gets that whole point. So nevertheless, that's quite a digression. Even so, Christian culture has survived because it superintended the organization of Western personality in ways that produced the necessary corporate identities, serving a larger communal purpose, institutionalized in the churches themselves. Ernest Trilsch was correct in his institutional title for the moral demand system preceding the one now emerging out of its complete ruin. He called it a church civilization, an authoritarian and coercive culture. Unquote. What binding address now describes our successor culture? In what does this self now try to find salvation, if not in the breaking of the corporate identities and in an acute suspicion of all normative institutions? Now it is the cynic, the nihilist, the skeptic, the the destroyer that breaks all of the old law tables, as Nietzsche would say. That is the ideal. He's the Superman now, rather than the person that has tried to live by the winnowed wisdom of our ancestors, that great bequest, that tremendous inheritance that gives us great answers to the question, then how then shall we live? They don't want to live like Christ. They don't want to have morality. They don't want to be hemmed in by the thou shouts and the thou shalls. Western culture has a literary canon through which its character ideals were conveyed. What canons will replace the scriptural? None, I suppose. We are probably witnessing the end of a cultural history dominated by book religions and word makers. The elites of the emergent culture, if they do not destroy themselves and all the culture with a dynamism they appear unable to control, are being trained in terminologies that have only the most tenuous relation to any historic culture or its incorporative self-interpretations. It needs to be noted that in particular on the geographic margins of our moral demand system, and in the Orient, the rejection of religious culture, even in principle, is far from complete. By contrast, the communist movement may be viewed as culturally conservative, belonging to the classical tradition of moral demand systems. Well, okay, fine. So if you're going to say any moral demand system that makes moral demands is somehow conservative, then you can lump the communists into it, because the communist has lots of demands, even though they might run counter to that fixed human nature. I don't think this is particularly helpful, but it does kind of show you the dichotomy of what's emerging today and how different it is from all that has come before it. The revolution in the West is profoundly cultural, whereas in the East, with all its defensive doctrine of the cultural as a mere superstructure of the techno-political class system, has only less certainly been so. Of the two, our revolution, I think, is the more profound one. Communist culture, no less than the Christian, is in trouble. It cannot stave off a revolution coming out of the West, in part as a repercussion in that it renounces the renunciatory mode of communism. The Russian Cultural Revolution is already being signaled by the liberation, however grudgingly, of the intellectuals from creedal constraints. And when you understand that, when you understand Confucianism and the history of China, what you'll see is that, well, Confucius came out at a time when God, the people, and the government were kind of combined. And so, in some ways, maybe China, sadly, tragically, is perhaps more suited to have an enduring communism than the Western communists of the Soviet Union did, because they're more buttressed. They have bulwarks around them against the revolutionizing force of this nihilistic culture. Boy, if we could only import or export that to them, maybe that whole thing would collapse. But nevertheless, he's writing in 1966 here, we must not forget. The new religiosity is remissive. It represents no mere literary challenge, as in the time of the Enlightenment. The would-be instinctual everyman and his girlfriend are the enlightened ones now. A Freud would be quite superfluous, especially in view of the fact that he ought to find ways other than neurotic of supporting renunciations. Yeah, I mean, when you live in a culture that has completely renunciated the idea of renunciating our instincts, then you don't need to find alternative ways other than neurotic of supporting renunciations. Indeed, Freud has already receded into history. His problems are not ours. The psychoanalytic movement, no less than its rational predecessors, has been ruined by the popular and commercial pressure upon it to help produce the symbolic for the reorganization of personality. After the central experience of deconversion, of which Freud was the last great theorist, had been completed. Fixed as they are at the historical stage of deconversion, responsible psychotherapists continue to struggle confusingly to discover their own proper attitude towards renunciatory moral demand systems, even as the normative character of their abandonment has altered both the theoretical work in the working conditions of clinical practice. So confused, psychiatrists and clinical psychologists in their hospital and consulting rooms stand almost as helpless as their functional predecessors and sometimes cultural opponents, the clergy. But other therapeutic elites are not in a better condition, as I've tried to bring out more elaborately in the final chapter. Our cultural revolution does not aim, like its predecessors, at victory for some rival commitment, but rather at a way of using all commitments, which amounts to loyalty toward none. It's kind of a smorgasbord. I can just now pick all of the stuff that had come before and choose this, that, and the other without ever having to commit. I don't have to become a Christian. I can look at some of the things Christ said. I like that. I like some of the things Moses said. Okay, I like some of the things Muhammad said. Confucius, Lao Tzu, Buddha. I can pick it all and then form my personality thusly according to my own lights. By psychologizing about themselves interminably, Western men are learning to use their internality against the primacy of any particular organization of personality. This restructuring of the Western imagination succeeds in establishing itself, complete with institutional regimes, then human autonomy, if this happens, if this restructuring of Western imagination succeeds in establishing itself, complete with institutional regimes, then human autonomy from the compulsions of culture may follow the freedoms already won from the compulsion of nature. With such a victory, culture, as previously understood, need suffer no further defeats. It is conceivable that millennial distinctions between inner and outer experience, private and public life, will become trivial. The individual heart need have no reasons of its own that the corporate head cannot understand and then exploit for some augmentation of the individual's sense of well-being. Thinking need not produce nausea or despair as its final answer to the assessment of communal purpose, because men will have ceased to seek any salvation other than the amplitude in living itself. Faith can then grow respectable again, as one entertainable and passing personal experience among others, to enhance the interests of living freed from communal purpose. The significance marks attached to the division of labor for the organization of society may have bearing in our emergent culture on the variety of entertainments. To paraphrase Marx and Engels, all morality, be it ascetic or hedonistic, loses its force with a therapeutical outlook. In other words, when you take on the attitude of the therapeutic, when you become psychological man, even asceticism and hedonistic can help, can be coerced, exploited by a therapeutic to help you get to your sense of well-being. Everything becomes a step up, and so instead of us becoming truly good men, we might end up being awful people who feel really good about ourselves. And that, I think, is really ends up being a cul-de-sac of despair, because the reason people search for those things in the first place often is because they feel terrible about themselves. And then so they follow this passion, they become faddist, they follow first Zen Buddhism, and then they follow one newfangled faith after another. They end up going to the evangelical churches, those emotive churches, which are a little more than motivational speakers and gosh, it just feels great to be human kind of bullcrap, instead of demanding that you actually work on yourself and shed sin to rise. And I just think that since this book has been written, we've seen all of these fads that have come by, and people aren't happier. They're not getting happier, and their sense of well-being is not increasing. I think you see that particularly because we're the most prosperous society. Never before in all of history has man had such a wide distribution of wealth. Think about it. I mean, you just drive around. I live in a rather blue-collar part of Detroit, and you drive around downriver and you see people driving the finest cars, and they're spending tons of money at restaurants and bars, and they're going to tons of expensive hockey, football, baseball, basketball games. They have endless entertainments on which they spend their money, but they they seem terribly disgruntled, and they want a more empowered state to come in and fix everything that they think is wrong. So I don't think that this therapeutic is leading us towards better people. The typical character that is being created by our culture is a psychological man that is quite discontented, let's put it that way. Sorry, that was quite a digression there. So, like its predecessors, the emergent culture must formulate its own controls, no less than the preceding one defined its remissions. It is in the process of doing so already. We are, I fear, getting to know one another. Reticence, secrecy, concealment of self have been transformed into social problems. Once they were aspects of civility, when the great Western formulary, summed up in the creedal phrase, know thyself, encouraged obedience to communal purposes rather than suspicion of them. Self-knowledge, again made social, is the principle of control upon which the emergent culture may yet be able to make itself stable. Indeed, with the arts of the psychiatric management enhanced and perfected, men will come to know one another in ways that could facilitate the total socialization without a symbolic of communal purpose. Then, the brief historic fling of the individual celebrating himself as a being in himself, divine and therefore essentially unknowable, would be truly ending no less certainly than the preceding personifications of various renunciatory disciplines. Men already feel freer to live their lives with a minimum of pretense to anything more grand than a sweetening of the time. Perhaps it is better so. In cultures past, men sacrificed themselves to heroic and cruel deceptions and suffered for glories that once mirrored their miseries. Not until psychological men overcome lives of squalor can they truly test their assumption that the inherited ideals of glory are no longer required. Affluence achieved, the creation of a knowing rather than a believing person, able to enjoy life without erecting high symbolic hedges around it, distinguishes the emergent culture from its predecessor. The new anti-culture aims merely at an eternal interim ethic of release from inherited controls. And I talk about the end of history. The new anti-culture aims merely at an eternal interim ethic of release from all inherited controls. In other words, just do what you want. That's the new ethic. Who is to say that these controls are eternal? I do not think so. Even Christian theologians no longer say so with any confidence. And some are saying rather that the new releases are holier than the old controls. Yet, even among churchmen, there are those who understand anew that their religion is nothing if not the organization of communal purpose in the conservation of inherited culture. They therefore place desperate hope in the movement of Dr. Martin Luther King as the chief spokesman. He kind of alluded to this earlier, how in 1966, the churchmen who felt like they were losing their strength and their moral demands on the culture were staking their hope in the black rights movement, which of course I think is one of the things that really did unite Christians, is that no, all men are created equal. We all have that spark of divinity. God loves them as much as he loved the next person. That his judgment really only comes at the end, but nevertheless that each person has a role to play. And I think he gets this. He gets this wrong. I think that instead of saying even amongst churchmen there are those who understand anew that their religion is nothing if not the organization of communal purpose and the conservation of inherited culture. I think that is wrong. I think that more and more it is the case, and we can say that with Vogelin, that the more widespread Christian culture becomes, the more it is likely that people will fall through the cracks of that culture, and they will lose their faith because they don't have the spiritual stamina for that heroic journey that is Christianity. And so I think that converse in opposition to the idea that the churchmen realize their religion is really just about the organization of communal purpose. No, it is about what it's always been, which is the individual the salvation of each individual. although secondary to that is the idea that we need to create a culture that we can have, where we can agree that no, living as our Savior showed us is the right way to live, and we want to have cultural hedges that enable that within that. And that's what I think is going to end up happening, frankly, if I were to jump ahead, and he doesn't say that here, but nevertheless, my idea is that eventually what's going to happen is we're going to see a disintegration of our societies into enclaves where people can live as Christians if they want. If you want to live as Satanists, you can go live there too. Well, you've already got that. You go do that, go downtown, right outside downtown Detroit, and you can do that if you'd like. But there will be all these different competing cultures. We'll have, as Jefferson called it, the laboratories of democracy, different enclaves where people can then go and live according to their hierarchy of values. And then we'll see who's more prosperous, who's happier, who are better people. What is the typical character that culture is creating? And it'll be very difficult to see how they establish their hedges around their culture to keep out those corruptive and subversive forces. How will you keep the barbarians at the gate instead of raising them up within your cultural enclave itself? I think that's where we're headed in the future. Nevertheless, increasing members of churchmen have allied themselves with the Negro religious leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, in what they have reluctantly understood must be a common struggle for the rebirth of their moral demand system against vastly superior numbers of nominally Christian or Jewish barbarians. This slowly reforming Christian cultural elite, apparent fellow travelers of the movement of Negro nonviolent protest, but in reality its critical aggregate, may yet save the United States from a barbarism long evident in the conduct of their own church's members in ordinary American commercial activity and in the extraordinary incivilities of the American social manner. Yet there may be little power of Christian renewal in the movement of Negro protest. For the American Negro has been focusing for releasing images in the dominant white culture, whereas affluent white society, as it grows more affluent, may draw nearer to their idea of the Negro as the model enjoyer of the relaxed life. Boy, there's so many words here that are pregnant with things that people today would get so offended by, but that idea is profoundly prejudicial to the renewal sought by the religious leadership, both black and white. The present releases, in growing more dominant, must achieve institutional affirmations of the prevalent feeling. Critically, to elaborate such affirmations has been the historical function of Western intellectuals, but not yet able to produce imagery that would mark the trail for many memories. Contemporary writers and artists, all those intellectuals slightly ahead of their time, mainly produce moods of solicitude about themselves, as if they could not bear the weight of the freedom from their inherited role upon which they themselves insist. This temper against moralizing has its justifications. The Germans recently manipulated all corporate identities and communal purposes with a thoroughness against which the analytic attitude may be our surest protection. Under such protection, it may not be possible to organize culture again as an unwitting dynamic of moral demands, claiming the prerogatives of truth, exercised through creedally authoritative institutions. Where family and nation once stood, or church and party, there will be hospital and the theater too. The normative institutions of the next culture will be the hospital and the theater. Trained to be incapable of sustaining sectarian satisfactions, psychological man cannot be susceptible to sectarian control. Religious man was born to be saved. Psychological man is born to be pleased. The difference was established long ago when I believe the cry of the ascetic lost precedence to one feels, the caveat of the therapeutic. And if the therapeutic is to win out, then surely the psychotherapist will be his secular, spiritual guide. However one may judge the validity of multiple truths at which science and history arrive, My interest is their social viability. The next culture may be viable without being valid. On the other hand, the old faiths could be judged valid even by those who consider them now no longer viable. In order to attend fairly to the competing beliefs and unbeliefs, one must struggle to use neutral terms. A sociological vocabulary keeps a certain distance from both new permissions and old inhibitions. The distance is not only possible, is the only possible justification for such jargon as I have used in the present volume, except as a device for gaining perspective. Sociological jargon is a curse, first of all, upon the intellectual lives of the sociologists. Sociological writing itself is an ineluctable part of the psychohistorical process, engaged as it is in the persuasive redefinitions of action that alter the action. Can the present releases become the predicates of new controls? Viewed traditionally, the continuing shift from controlling to a releasing symbolic may appear as the dissolution of culture. Yeah, I think so. Viewed sociologically, the dominance of releasing motifs in which the releasers themselves evolve as new modes of control, with patterns of consumption as our popular discipline, implies a movement of Western culture away from its former configuration toward one in which old ideological contents are preserved mainly for their therapeutic potential, as interesting deposits of past motifs of moralizing. No imperative can then develop a monopoly on sentiment, because none will be backed by a deeply ingrained system of inner ordinances. I do not refer to a, quote, sensuous culture, but to one that prepares for adaptability in matters of the spirit. There is no special affection reserved in this volume for the superiority of usually claimed for spiritual over sensual concerns. And this will become clear as we go further. In the emergent culture, a wider range of people will have spiritual concerns and engage in spiritual pursuits. There will be more singing and more listening. People will continue to genuflect and read the Bible, which has long achieved the status of great literature, but no prophet will denounce the rich attire or stop the dancing. There will be more theater, not less, and no Puritan will denounce the stage and draw its curtains. On the contrary, I expect that modern society will mount psychodramas far more frequently than its ancestors mounted miracle plays, with patient analysts acting out their inner lives, after which they can extemporize the final act as interpretation. We shall even institutionalize the hospital theater, the Fremdungscht effect, the effect of distancing oneself, the alienating effect, will actually become something that the hospital theater triumphantly enacts. I'll just read the whole sentence again. We shall even institutionalize in the hospital theater the separating or the alienating effect, with the therapeutic triumphantly enacting his own discovered will. In other words, we're going to make the hero the guy that alienates himself from a controlling culture. Everybody will just fly out towards the periphery, out to that space of shadow and despair, where every little person will be an empty, hollow man, a flat-souled person they'll have their own specialism, they'll have their own vocation, their own way of providing for themselves, but they will be loose from that great bequest of the winnow wisdom of our ancestors. They'll have no idea what they're doing, and the only way to tell them all apart out there in the periphery will be by their tattoos or the cars they drive or the totemism that make them say, oh, I'm a Buckeye or I'm a Wolverine. But they will all be insubstantial non-entities, quarreling with one another, reduced to barbarism, and it will be that Hobbesian battle of all against all, where life is nasty, brutish, and short, instead of being, and this is where I think Chesterton was brilliant when he said that instead of being centrifugal, genius needs to be centric. That when you really start moving towards the center of all things, you kind of fill up on it, And so the whole idea is that there is, as Russell Kirk said, an enduring moral order. And the truly wise man is attempting to ascertain that order and conform his soul with it. And then by so doing, they fill up on that truth. That's why one of my favorite lines I ever wrote was that every great book you read adds a ring to your soul the way years add girth to trees. Instead, now everybody's just flying out towards the periphery, and everybody's this little man, empty, but he has the tattoos and all the gear and the stuff to fill his existential emptiness. The wisdom of the next social order, as I imagine it, would not reside in right doctrine administered by the right men who must be found, but rather in doctrines amounting to permission for each man to live an experimental life. Thus, once again, culture will give back what it has taken away. All governments will be just so long as they secure that consoling plenitude of option in which modern satisfactions really consist. In this way, it's like Brave New World, isn't it? Huxley was, in many ways, far more anticipatory than Orwell. In this way, the emergent culture could drive the value problem clean out of the social system, and, limiting it to a form of philosophical entertainment in lieu of edifying preachment, could successfully conclude the exercise for which politics is the name. The end of politics. Everybody's rich, everybody's making up their own rules, everybody's their own experimental life, and everybody's alienated, and he thinks maybe this is where it gets really kind of silly. This is where he thinks maybe this is a good solution to all our problems. Problems of democracy need no longer prove so difficult as they have been. Psychological man is likely to be indifferent to the ancient question of legitimate authority. They'll say, who cares what the rules are? Just give me my stuff. Of sharing in government, they'll be indifferent to the idea of sharing in the governmental process of self-rule, so long as the powers that be can preserve the social order and manage an economy of abundance. The danger of politics lies more in the ancients straining to create those symbols or support those institutions that narrow the range of virtues or too narrowly define the sense of well-being. For the latter seems to be the real beatitude towards which men have always strained. No. Psychological man, in his independence from all gods, can feel free to use all God terms. I imagine he will be a hedger against his own bets, a user of any faith that lends itself to therapeutic use. The penultimate paragraph here. Culture as therapy becomes realizable in part because of the increasing automaticity of the productive system. But without the discipline of work, a vast re-ritualization of social life will probably occur to contain aggression in a steady state and maintain necessary levels of attention to activity. The rules of health indicate activity. Psychological man can exploit older cultural precepts, ritual struggle no less than play therapy, in order to maintain the dynamism of his culture. Of course, the newest Adam cannot be expected to limit himself to the use of old constraints. If immoral materials rejected under earlier cultural criteria are therapeutically effective, enhancing somebody's sense of well-being, well, then they're useful. The end, or the goal, is just to keep going. Americans, as F. Scott Fitzgerald concluded, believe in the green light. I am aware that these speculations may be thought to contain some parodies of an apocalypse. But what apocalypse has ever been so kindly? What culture has ever attempted to see to it that no one's ego is hurt? Perhaps the elimination of the tragic sense, which is tantamount to the elimination of irreconcilable moral principles, is no tragedy at all. Civilization could be, for the first time in history, the expression of human contents rather than a consolatory control of discontents. Then, and only then, would the religious question receive a markedly different answer from those dominant until recently in our cultural history. And my side note here is that tragically, sadly, the plenitude of contenting options only leave us with an acute but vague discontented feeling that there must be more meaning. As Russell Kirk says, after the dreams of avarice, we will develop a forlorn longing for things beyond recall. We'll have everything that we want. We'll have all the stuff that we want, except for the things that really give life its inner meaning. And we won't know how to go back and recover it, because the road will have filled up with jungle the way back. So anyways, hope you enjoyed my reading of the introductory chapter of The Triumph of the Therapeutic, Philip Rieff's 1966 book. The first couple chapters are pretty amazing, and I'll be writing about them quite a bit in the future. Anyhow, have a great day.